Tēnā koutou katoa, and a warm welcome to everyone joining us this morning for this webinar. It's really wonderful to have you here, particularly for all our New Zealand teachers joining us as it is the first week of the holidays. So we really are appreciative that you have joined us. A couple of housekeeping matters before we kick off. The webinar will last for around about 40 to 45 minutes. And we will be opening up to questions from our audience today. We ask that you type in any questions to us using the chat function, which is the little speech bubble down the bottom of your screen, and I will feed those into conversation. And we are recording the webinar today, and that will be available on our website in the next couple of days. So if you have colleagues who weren't able to make it, they will be able to access the video afterwards. It's now my real pleasure to welcome Heather Peshak George, who is a research professor at the University of South Florida. She also is co-director of the National Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports in the US. And Heather, it's really wonderful to have you joining us here this morning in New Zealand, but Monday evening for you. So welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to have to know so many people are here on their first week of holidays. So thank you, everybody, for joining us.
And for those of you who don't know, Heather has actually created a wonderful series of research reviews for us, which are all available on our website. So we do encourage you to check those out as well. Heather will be building on many of the ideas that she discusses in those guides here this morning with us. So Heather, just to start us off this morning, when we talk about classroom management or behaviour management, what is it that we mean?
Essentially, if you're a teacher, it's your method that you use to maintain order in the classroom and what you do to maintain order that's most conducive for student achievement. So ideally, we would hope that it's positive. Ideally, we hope it's based in evidence-based practices. But essentially, it's that structure, how you're organizing that classroom environment, and that is going to help lead to achieving those desired outcomes that you want for your classroom. And I'm sorry about my dogs. They have amazing time when they want to bark.
Not a problem at all. And are there particular principles or practices that teachers and or schools should be using when they approach their classroom management?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So, you know, you guys are all familiar. You hear people constantly talking about evidence-based practices, and we used evidence-based practices for that's what we're actually using and interacting with. The systems that we set up and support, so those systems in our classroom are what's going to support how we're implementing those practices. And then overall, the data that we're using are going to help guide us in that ongoing decision making, because we need to figure out in the classroom what's working and what's not working. When we identify what's not working, it's going to help us come up with more strategies to figure out what we need to do. But there's essentially 5 primary evidence-based practices that have been shown in the research that when they are implemented with fidelity, that they do lead to fewer disruptions, improved student behavioral and academic outcomes, and it allows us as teachers to have much more time to be able to teach, which inevitably then the students are learning more and have a greater likelihood of success. So those 5 main areas and the the documents that I created for you guys, there's 5 shorter ones that go into each of those 5 practices. So the first one deals with maximizing structure. The second one is specific around teaching expectations, routines, and procedures. The third one's actively engaging students. And the fourth one's dealing with acknowledging appropriate behavior. And then the 5th one is dealing with responding to appropriate behavior. And there's methods in which we can go about all of these. There's actually evidence base around how we implement those different practices. But when we carefully plan how we're going to do this, that's starting to create your classroom management system.
Brilliant. So I think what would be really useful is if we sort of delve into each of those 5 principles or practices in a little bit more detail, and you can talk to us about what you actually mean by that and sort of some of the things that teachers should or could be thinking about. So if we start with the first one, this idea of maximizing structure, what do we mean when we talk about structure?
So essentially you're thinking about how am I going to set up this effective, this safe classroom environment that's supportive for all the kids in my classroom. And it's also going to promote a positive teaching and learning experience for all, because we want to have the opportunity, an equitable opportunity for all students to be able to learn. And so one of the things we'll do for maximizing structure is talking about how do we effectively design the physical environment. Is there enough spacing for students to be able to move around the room? If they're bumping into each other, that starts to increase the likelihood of people getting off task, and that physical touch can be disruptive. We also want to look at active supervision and proximity. So when we're looking at active supervision, it's not just a matter of the classroom teacher standing at the doorway, but it's a matter of we're actively scanning and seeing what's happening across the room, trying to make sure, in many ways, having the children think that we do have eyes in the back of our heads, but we're constantly scanning to make sure that we're seeing what is happening. If something is happening, we're going over, we're providing prompts. We might just standing nearby a student might be enough for them to maintain them to stay on task. And then developing these predictable classroom routines or procedures. And some of these predictable routines is thinking about, the first day of school when students come in, they don't know you, you don't know them, but it's your classroom, and talking about what do we want to have for consistency here. As a teacher what you want that makes sense for you, for the procedures. Do you want them to raise their hand when they have every question, or is it okay that they can go up to your desk if you're working and having quiet time? If they need to sharpen their pencil, what's your procedure for that? And it's starting to clearly outline and discuss that. And sometimes teachers will often, depending on the age level, will incorporate the students to develop these predictable classroom routines. Students need to know what they're supposed to do the minute they come in your classroom. Otherwise, if they don't, they'll find something to do. And usually it's not something we would want them to do.
So what I think is quite interesting hearing you talk about, and I think you've sort of in a way combined the first two principles around the structure and the routines. But what I find quite interesting is it's less about necessarily being really prescriptive. Each teacher needs to set up their classroom in exactly the same way, but it's more about each teacher thinking about what works for them in their context with their students. Is that right?
Yes, that's so important, because I think it's one thing, if there's standardized curriculum that you all are using, well, then that's set and we all need to use it a certain way. But the style that you bring into it as a teacher, that is your unique style. And that is something that absolutely needs to, students need to see that. And that's part of that relationship building. So I think it's important for folks to understand that when we're setting up this predictability and setting up some structure, in no way are we taking away your uniqueness, in no way, your individual instructional style and who you are as a person absolutely needs to maintain. So I think that's important for folks to know and to remember that.
Yeah. And we've had a question come through, and this is particularly in relation to the classroom space and the classroom environment. And one of the things that we've got happening in a number of New Zealand schools is what we call innovative learning environments. So this is where you have quite big open plan classrooms with a reasonably large number of students within them. And I think this teacher said actually what they have is less an issue of not enough space and students bumping into each other, but potentially too much space and the challenge that can bring. Do you have any advice, or is this an issue you've come across?
Well, I think that's going to be, yes, it's an issue we have in the United States. It's an issue that they have in Europe as well, and all over. If there's too little of space and too many people within that space, there's problems that occur. And then if there's too much space without clear guidance in what to do in that large space, then there's the likelihood of problems to occur as well. Again, when people start getting into if there's too much space, that often is because they don't know what to do with their time. And I know as a teacher, it can be frustrating because it's like, I've told them 1,000 times, they should know what to do. But there are some students we have to remind them. They could forget in an instant the minute they see their friends or they see somebody, across the way. They can let problem behavior get in the way with it. So I think it's always important that we're reminding them how to self-correct, providing those prompts to them, but making sure that folks are clear on what that appropriate behavior is. I think what's happening now with the pandemic is a great example of universal interventions. So when we think of kind of tier 1 interventions, something that everybody should do, they're saying in order to try to keep the numbers down, everybody needs to maintain their social distancing. They need to keep their masks on, keep washing your hands. And you think about they've been telling us that all year, but we still forget sometimes. So I still forgot the other day when I ran into a store, I forgot to pull my mask out and put it on, and people were looking at me strange. That was enough to cue me to put my mask on. The students are the same way with that. So we've got to think about, how are we also encouraging them when we do see them doing what's expected and following, whatever expectations you've got set up, and they are staying engaged. We need to acknowledge that and continue to remind them of that too. Great job, but that also teaches the other students too in that process and helps remind them oh, right, I've got to do this. And we all always know there's always going to be some students that need more prompts, more feedback, more active supervision to make sure that they're able to stay on track. But really, we've got to think about when it comes to behavior, we really need to treat it just as much as an instructional skill building piece as we do the academics, because we learned the hard way that they're not necessarily wired to know what they're supposed to do when they show up at school for the first time in your classroom. So we're going to have to really make sure to take time to teach that.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing for teachers to remember, is that you actually do need some explicit instruction around what it is you are expecting the children and the students in your classroom to be doing. We've had an interesting question come through about the balance between trying to create shared understanding around expectations, routines, and procedures across teachers within a school, whilst also ensuring that individual teachers don't lose their own sense of style and personality. How do you mediate between sort of that whole school versus individual approach?
Well, if you do have a school that is engaging, say you have school-wide expectations that are established, such as something around positive behavior interventions and supports, and say you're running students, your school motto might be, we're respectful, we're responsible, that type of thing. And so it would be, all right, what does that look like in the classroom? And I think, even if they're high school students, I found that high school students, all students of all ages can engage in some really interesting discussion about what that means. We even see that in the 2- and 3-year-olds, show us what this means to be respectful. And, we might have a toy and how we're playing with that toy and demonstrating and practicing with each other. But then even high school students, there's great ways to talk about it related to the literature they might be focusing at that time, or what might be happening in the current events, and to talk through that, and that's even also a perfect time to engage in restorative practices. For example, if there has been some issues that have occurred, how do we talk through what it means? What could people have done differently that might have been responsible? If we were faced in this in the future, what could we do? What are our options? And reminding folks of that. So when you're the classroom teacher, if there is school-wide expectations that are established across your whole school campus, I think it's important when you're taking it in your classroom, talking with your students. This is what it means for me, for you guys to be respectful, and how I'm going to be respectful to you. And so, we make eye contact. When one person's talking, the other person is listening. We, take turns, we're sharing, that type of thing. So it might look a little different because obviously what the students need to do within your classroom is a lot different than what they need to do in the hallway, than what they need to do in the cafeteria. But it's connected in that it's still being respectful, if that's a school-wide expectation, but you're telling them and showing them and working together on what it means as your community of being respectful. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And the person that's just written in to clarify the comments, because I think that's a really useful, incredibly useful for teachers to think about how they balance the school-wide expectations versus what happens in their own classroom. And
it's important too for teachers to know, sometimes as frustrating as it could be that we would hope that our leaders, our principals would do things a certain way. They have their own idea on how they want to lead. So they may not have school-wide expectations, and that might not be a priority to them, but it doesn't mean you can't have it in your classroom. And so I think that's important to know, that you still have that autonomy, that you can establish that in your classroom environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we come back to the principles that underpin effective classroom management, I think we're up to number 3, which is around active student and teacher engagement.
Yeah, so actively engaging students is the third one, which gets into providing high rates of opportunities to respond. That includes instructional pacing. Obviously, if something is too fast, it's hard for students to catch on and learn. If it's way too slow, they're going to get bored out of their mind. And how we're then pairing that to increasing positive behavior and decreasing inappropriate behavior. So we want to think about increasing the time students are directly engaged in the learning process, but also making sure that we're delivering that feedback to them on student learning, which not only helps, if you think about it in an academic way, when we're checking in and providing feedback on them and asking them to do, say, verbal, choral responding, we can get a sense right there. We know exactly, are they getting it or are they not? And we can go back and work on rebuilding that skill. But it also gives us an idea, if we're asking that of all of our students and they're all struggling to give us the correct answer, that also gives us feedback as a teacher. We need to go back and teach it differently, that teaching strategy may not have worked. And sometimes that happens. As hard as we try pulling our lesson plans together, sometimes they may be beautiful on paper, but sometimes they just didn't work out as well, and we have to readjust.
Yeah. And I think this is a particularly interesting principle, because I think often when we think about classroom management or behavior management, we think about it as something connected to but slightly separate from our sort of instructional practice in relation to learning. But this is very much connecting the two together and saying, actually, you can't distinguish between them, and that we have to think very carefully about how they fit together.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that's that piece of dynamic teaching that I think it's difficult to think in isolation, yet we have to treat behavior just as important as academics. Social emotional is just as important as academics, but we know that academics alone doesn't necessarily teach behavior, and teaching behavior alone doesn't necessarily teach the academic skills that they need. And so how do you balance that? And I think that's that part of trying to think about how do we continue to integrate this as a teacher. So you may be a content specialist in a particular area. It could be that you're the calculus teacher or you're the reading specialist. But it doesn't mean there's still expectations and there's still ways of teaching kids and giving them feedback on how to behave, but also letting them know at times if they're frustrated with the academics, that there are ways that they can ask for help that are appropriate. And I don't know how many of us as adults now had teachers that were that explicit in the process of teaching it, but we somehow learned it. And you do know that you probably have some family members or other adults that you know that could benefit from having some of those lessons too. So here we're just trying to cover the base and make sure that kids are learning what's expected of them, but it's going to require you guys to think about what do you expect of them behaviorally, and therefore then let's teach it and then give them a reason to use that new skill.
And then, so if we come on to principle number 4, it's around acknowledging appropriate behavior.
Yep. So this is where, sometimes people might refer to it as incentives or a reward, but honestly, it's that positive, specific feedback tied to that desired behavior. It's used as a teaching tool. It's no different than saying, thank you for raising your hand and waiting for me to call on you. That is acknowledging appropriate behavior. But when we're doing that, it helps to create that safe and positive, supportive environment. So ways that we would do that is there's behavior specific praise, like I said, like, thank you for raising your hand and waiting for me to call on you. There's times where we may prompt or pre-correct, such as, you're asking students what the question's going to be. And before you ask the question, say, and I know you're going to want to shout out, make sure you keep it to yourself, but raise your hand with it. That's a prompt. And in that piece, it's reminding them what the procedure is. The 5 positives to 1 correction. So that would be like trying to keep track of, am I acknowledging appropriate behavior 5 times more than the amount of time I'm correcting behavior? I think that's a great one to practice at home. It's a great one to practice quietly. You could put a small tape recorder in your pocket and just tape yourself for an hour, and you could go home and in quiet, you could say, how many times did I acknowledge kids for doing something appropriate? It's a lot harder to do than we think. But when we're thinking about that behavioral momentum piece, it's looking at, we're continuing to say, yep. Because I remember my daughter, when she was little, I clearly was in a mode of no. And she finally was like, Mom, tell me what to do. And she was absolutely right. And so I think there are times that we know what we want them to do, but we haven't necessarily conveyed exactly. And telling folks no or correcting them doesn't always show them what they're supposed to do instead. Another way for acknowledging appropriate behavior is group contingencies. So depending on the developmental level of the kids, and but there could be, classrooms working collectively towards earning something. It could be that it's groups of students. It could be a table of students for certain activities that they're working together. So there's all different ways that we could do this. And there's a lot of information out there about those different group contingencies.
And I'm guessing that the acknowledging appropriate behavior, it's a positive, not just for the student that you've acknowledged, well done for raising your hand, but it actually has a flow-on effect to all the other students in the class.
It's a great way, again, to remind everybody what's expected. So I'm based in Tampa Bay, so Florida is known as Disney World. And so Disney World is the land of fun and all of that stuff. But I'm telling you, during the pandemic now, what they will do is they will be holding up a sign if there's somebody whose mask has dropped down, and they will stand within a few feet and it will just say, please move, have your mask up. And they'll stand there. And after so much time, if somebody doesn't do that, they actually escort them out of the park. But they have much different contingencies, obviously, than we do in the school system. But that piece is, it's when you would see that sign go up, it's like, oh wait, is mine up too? It's the same thing. Or you would hear people say like, thank you for, standing and maintaining your social distancing. You look up at the store, it's like, oh, right. Have I done that? It's just those little reminders.
Yeah. And then if we come on to principle number 5, which I guess is sort of the opposite in ways of principle number 4, and that's how you respond when there's inappropriate behavior.
Yeah, as you guys know, if there's the more we react, that can escalate problem behavior. And so the way in which we respond can make a big difference on starting to de-escalate the problem behavior. So I think it helps create opportunities for students to learn the way we're responding to inappropriate behavior. I mean, students do need to be corrected. There's no doubt about it. But it also gives them an opportunity when we correct them, let's make sure they still know what they're supposed to do and give them that opportunity to practice what was expected from that. Helps kind of keep kids on task, keep the learning moving forward. And so I think there's ways that we can do this when you're correcting students, you're redirecting students. There could be times, depending on the function of behavior, that you're going to plan to ignore, especially if it's attention-seeking behavior. Maybe it's teaching the other students at times too to ignore the one particular student. There might be at times, there may be some timeout from reinforcement that occurs, but it's also could be that you're acknowledging all of the other students for being on task, and they're all benefiting from that positive feedback, but that one student is not. Again, we've got to be careful in how we do this, because sometimes the students that are not engaging in problem behavior, they're the ones that need an awful lot of positive reinforcement and may not have gotten a lot of it in the past. So again, there's different ways. We've just got to always try to think of trying to be as objective as possible of, did I respond in the best way in that incident that happened earlier in the day? How could I have done that differently? What can I do to help prevent something like that in the future? And if there is a problem behavior, what can I do that maybe could reduce the probability that it's as intense as it was? Because remember, you're human too. And so when we get caught in the middle of those things, without us practicing how we're going to respond differently, we're going to go to what we're used to.
And we've had a couple of questions come in around this particular principle, and so sort of they've come at it from slightly different angles, but really how you respond if you have a student at school who is there just because they have to, but they really don't want to be there at all, and it's creating problem behaviors, or for those students who seemingly don't seem to want or respond to being praised or to settle into their learning. Do you have any strategies or advice for teachers around those sorts of instances?
Yeah, those are great questions. And, I think the one thing to always remember, that what's rewarding or reinforcing to one person may not be the same for others. And sometimes too much reinforcement of something isn't always such a good thing. So an example of that is people might like pancakes. We all know if you eat too many pancakes, what you feel like afterwards. So it might have been reinforcing, but too much isn't necessarily a good outcome. So I think thinking about with the different students, really being able to identify or get a good gauge of what the function of behavior is. So if you have a student that isn't motivated to learn at all, and they're engaging in other problem behaviors, something is getting them at school, motivating them to get there for some reason. And thinking about, is it a lot of peer attention that they're getting? Maybe it's a lot of positive or just a lot of adult attention they're getting. It may not be the desired attention that you want to be providing them, but they're getting it, they're taking it, they're demanding it. And so you've got to think about, how can we switch that if it truly is motivated by those functions. I've had a student who, or we've had several students who engaged in all kinds of, we would say, horseplay behavior. They were not expected to graduate on time. And it became really clear when you started to talk to the student had very low expectations for themselves. They didn't expect to graduate either. And it ended up, they didn't expect to, because a lot of the adults didn't expect them to also. So we gave them some actual tasks. We said, we need your help. We need your help to help us collect some data on the amount of problems that are happening in the hallway. Of course, these were students who happened to engage in a lot of problem behavior in the hallway. And I said, I need you to do a timer and to see how long it really is taking students to go from this classroom to this classroom. And can you, collect this data? Can you help graph it? He happened to be a middle school student, that's something they're working on. Of course, he didn't do the work on it in class, but now he has a role. And let me tell you, that student would give me the best data. He was horrified in reporting of how many other students were off task. Didn't quite make that connection initially that was the same behaviors he typically engaged in, but now he had a role. He had a reason to be there. And it's starting to get that hook of like, okay, now add this. I need you to be in class on task during this amount of time so that you then can earn the time to collect these data for me. And so it took some time to work through, so many months, but by the end, that kid graduated on time, but we had to work with it and work with the teachers too. And we were determined we're going to succeed with him. We're going to give him a reason to be here. For students that aren't motivated, there are some students that aren't motivated by what is being rewarded, being acknowledged, that type of thing. I would try having a separate conversation with those students. There's preference assessments that could be given to them where they fill out a checklist on, what they would find rewarding. Sometimes it's things we would never think of that don't cost any money whatsoever. But I think trying to find out, from them about that. Other times we may realize that work is much too difficult. I think sometimes too, for kids that are disengaged, this starts to be a big sign that there's something else either going on at home, something going on potentially with them and their learning. It could be that there's an undiagnosed learning disability that we don't know yet. It could be that there may be some mental health concerns, but I think it's always important to know that there may be some other reasons of what's happening for this.
Yeah, so I guess really at the heart of it, it's around knowing the students as individuals, taking the time to talk with them and to find out what's going on, and then, if necessary, creating a differentiated approach for different students, depending on what it is that they need and what they're telling us.
And it's hard, yes, and it is hard. And so for teachers, you guys, we all know it's hard and it's a lot of work. And the payoff, though, is so much greater in the end when you are able to, build some of that trust, build that relationship with the student. And there's always going to be a tough student, I think. And we're learning as we're going too with it. But there's also a lot of variables that we can't control, what might be happening after school hours and in the evening or the morning before school. We may not have control of that as a teacher, but I think it's important that the condition and the environment that you set up in your classroom can help them start to see, maybe this is my safe space. This is a different space. This might be time that I hear the expectations. This is who I would go talk to if I'm having problems. And so otherwise, there's sometimes kids where things are so difficult at home, whether it's food insecurity, home insecurity, anything else happening, that they may not be excited to learn, but they are happy to be at school. And so, I think as much as we can, trying to build the relationships and build the relationships with other people in your school, the other adults, because you need, they might know something or have some ideas or can help provide some objective observation in your classroom to assist.
Yeah. And I think that connecting with other people across your school is a really interesting and important point. And just building on that, I know that a lot of what we've discussed so far has focused on sort of the individual classroom and the individual teacher. To what extent do you think that schools as a whole need an explicit management or behaviour management policy, which all teachers and students are expected to follow, versus having something a bit more ad hoc?
Yeah, I mean, I want you guys to know that you still can make differences and change within your classroom, even if it's not a whole school approach. But we also know that we can be much more positively impactful and much more efficient if we are able, the whole school is to come on board. So how that's done is it's, clearly setting up strategies that school-wide, such as, what would be our expectations school-wide? What is the procedure if there are problem behaviors in a classroom? What are the expected procedures that teachers are to follow and that we're going to communicate to families and students if there are problem behaviors? What are the expected procedures for acknowledging kids when they are doing the right thing? How are we going to adjust possibly our instructional design across our school, the type of curriculum we select, and the way in which we deliver it to best support what our whole school approach is? And then how are we going to use data across not only our individual classroom, but across the whole school to make decisions? So if there's adjustments that need to be made, if there's a lot of problem behaviors that happen in the cafeteria, as teachers, you need to know. And you need to know, okay, there's a reason why more of us need to be in there for supervision. But if then there are less problems that occur because there are more of us in there, we need that feedback too. So that specific feedback, the adults need that too, because they need to know that what they're doing is making a difference too.
And building on that point around, that gathering some form of data to understand whether what you're doing is actually making a difference. I know that you've done quite a lot of work around the use of data to guide effective classroom management. Can you talk a little bit about what you actually mean when you talk about the use of data in that way?
Yeah, so there's, obviously you guys are used to as individual student data to monitor progress, our students on grade level, the attendance issues, those types of things. But I think we're also looking at overall school-wide data too. So, if there's a whole school approach, is the school implementing it with fidelity as it was intended to do? Are there specific goals that are set up or outcomes? Some of that might be, we want our lowest 25% increasing their reading proficiency. Okay, so what strategies are going to be put in place? What data would you use then to track that? How often are you going to track that? And then I think from looking at the various types of data, from individual student outcomes to fidelity types of data, then it's going through a problem solving process. So we've got to identify what the problem is, but we need to do something about it, because we don't need to admire it. anymore. So we've got to figure out, why is it happening? And then start to look at, what am I going to do about it? And that's where you're coming up with strategies for that. And then that evaluation piece is it working based on those interventions? And you can do that on an individual student, but you can also do that school-wide. You can do that across your classroom wide overall. And so there's all different kinds of things to ask. I think in one of the briefs that spoke specifically about data, there's environmental considerations where you've got to ask yourself, is the structure, is there minimal crowding? Do we have the schedules posted? Have I made sure to teach what's expected in the classroom? There's also behavior system considerations, such as, have I clearly defined the behaviors? Have I taught the behaviors? Do I, remind the students of that? And then when students are engaging in those expected behaviors, am I acknowledging them in the process? And what do I do to respond to problem behavior? And then I think it's important too to also look at the curriculum and instructional considerations, because those obviously can impact behavior too, such as, have I been clear in communicating and students practicing what's expected of them to do during the instructional times? Is there a particular content area that's always happening when I have the most problem behaviors in my school or in my classroom? So you can think of, it always happens to be during group time, well, that's when you think back, like, okay, where are kids seated? Do they know what the expectations they're supposed to do? Do I give them too much time? Do I need to be more explicit in the directions? So I think that's where you start to engage in the problem solving to break it down. But I also know it's a lot of work to figure all of this out and design the lesson plans and teach the lesson plans and make sure to try to create an environment to keep students actively engaged. So it does help being able to recruit other adults in your building and to figure out if there's an opportunity, whether it's co-teaching, whether it's, can they come in and visit during certain times and provide some direct observational feedback for you. Because sometimes we might be looking at it, but we're so invested, we don't see it as objectively. And sometimes another set of eyes can help us. Yeah,
I think there are lots of valuable things in what you've just spoken about. And I think the idea of approaching the improvement around classroom management and behavior management in the same ways that you would approach sort of your more academic concerns that you might have about a child is a really interesting one. And again, I think that idea of bringing in another adult to actually observe what's going on in your classroom is, and I know it's really difficult because teachers and schools are unbelievably busy, but that extra pair of eyes can be incredibly valuable in terms of letting you see something that you ordinarily wouldn't when you're in the course of everyday teaching.
Yes. And so it's a hard job being a teacher. You guys know that. That's why I'm so impressed that you're here on your holiday.
Now we're fast coming to the end of our time. We've been going 45 minutes, but Heather, I just wondered whether there were a couple of key takeaways that you wanted to leave people with today that you think are particularly important for them to be thinking about when they think about classroom management.
I think it's important for you guys to know that I think it's important for you to have your own vision for what you want within your classroom, because that vision will then help you then define and create some of your own professional goals. And I think sometimes we forget and get so caught into the accountability and the responsibility of what students need to be taught that we forget about ourselves as professionals in that process. And we're humans and we're still learning too. And I think it's important for us to be able to say, what kind of a year do I want to have? Or if your year's halfway through, what do I want to have for the rest of the semester? What would I like to see within my classroom? And I think from there, it's then developing goals of what's it going to take for me to do this as a teacher? And what kind of data will I use on myself and my students to see that I'm making some steps forward in this process. And, you know, I think it's important that the more you work towards creating these positive, predictable, safe learning environments, it not only builds the relationships, helps to improve the quality of life of the students and families, but it helps to improve your quality of life too, in that it's not so negative and you're not going to go home as tired. And it doesn't mean that problem behaviors stop happening altogether. You know, that's not realistic, but it's starting to look at your setting your goals, and seeing what do I need to do to help put into place, and then have even the students work with you on that process, because everybody tends to have a much better experience when they are focusing on the positive. I'm not saying completely ignore problems, but sometimes we get so caught into the negative that it's hard to look up and realize, wait, there's 20 other students that are doing the right thing. That's something to celebrate. How do I keep that going and remind myself and celebrate that? And now I'll focus on what extra stuff I need to do to try to prevent the problem behavior of these other students.
Yeah, and it's a really wonderful, positive message to leave teachers with. And I'm guessing that it's also never too late for teachers to start making some of these changes within their own practice, and that it's something that they can employ partway through a school year. It doesn't just have to be at the start of a school year. They can actually start straight away.
Absolutely. And it's going to take practice, because we have been practicing things, whether they've been effective or not, for a long time. So we are going to have to, if you want to do something different, and even just try it for yourself on trying to acknowledge things appropriately all throughout the day, it is much harder to do because it's not common in how we were typically taught.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Heather, thank you so much. You have given us lots of things to think about, and lots of different approaches and ideas for teachers to start trialing in their own practices. So thank you so much. And I just remind everyone that do check out the guides that Heather has written, because they reinforce a lot of the ideas here. They share some more strategies that you can immediately employ in your practice, and there's lots of wonderful information in them. So Heather, thank you so much. Really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you, everyone. And thank all of you for being in the profession. So we need more awesome teachers out there. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And just a reminder that those guides that Heather's written are available on our website. And just now to wish everyone a really lovely holidays, and hope that you can now go away and relax and enjoy them. Thank you so much.